suggestions in how to deal with these situations that we are all in at the moment. I'm Garima Jain, and I'm a practice consultant at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, or IIHS. Currently, I'm based in Delhi. So this workshop is a part of a 3-year project called Recovery with Dignity, which was co-led by the IIHS and University of East Anglia in Norwich. It's funded by the British Academy, but the project explored the idea of experiences of recovery in post-disaster situations across 3 states in India: Odisha, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, and examined how recovery processes and actors represent vulnerable people and places. But truly, at the heart of the project was the idea to focus on recognizing and respecting the dignity of the affected populations. This workshop in particular is an experiment to draw from a variety of cases and different knowledge systems from different contexts that suggest alternate pathways to reimagine recovery, such that the focus kind of shifts from this idea of post-disaster to an idea that disasters themselves are a continuum, and therefore responding to that continuum in some ways. But in particular, the reason to choose to do this workshop in this time was also to draw lessons from past disasters about recovery narratives, responses, and outcomes, and understand the way forward for post-COVID-19 recovery that we are all part of at this point. This session, in specific, apart from all the other sessions, this session aims to reflect on the current disaster recovery practices and policies at different scales at the national, state, and local levels in India, but also at the global level across, especially taking cases from the global south, to highlight the challenges faced by various actors in enabling inclusive recovery processes and the innovations being made at the same time to ensure long-term holistic recovery of those affected by disasters in the past. So there are 2 parts to this discussion that we'll have today. One would focus more on identifying the challenges that are being faced by different actors, and the second part would focus more on identifying the way forward for us from here. And to help us do that, we have with us an esteemed set of panelists today with vast and diverse experiences in the field of disaster risk reduction and recovery in India and other global south and north contexts. So I'll start with briefly introducing all of you here that you can see on the screen with me. Mr. Kamal Kishore is a member at the National Disaster Management Authority, Government of India. He has worked on disaster risk reduction and recovery issues for over 25 years at the local, national, regional, and global levels. And prior to joining NDMA, he also worked with the United Nations Development Programs, UNDP, for nearly 13 years in New Delhi, Geneva, and New York. But most importantly, he has long been a champion for early recovery issues and long-term sustainable outcomes. So we really look forward to hearing on those issues here. Mr. Sekhar Kuriakose is a member secretary at the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority and head scientist at the State Emergency Operations Center. Prior to joining the KSDMA, he also worked with the UNDP and the World Bank. He is also a reviewer for several international journals, including Journal of Environmental Management, Natural Hazards, and Geomorphology and Landslides. So he brings in both a practice but also a research perspective into this discussion. Mr. Behera, Mr. Aurobindo Behera, is a retired senior officer from the Indian Administrative Services and was previously the managing director of Odisha State Disaster Management Authority. He also held important positions in various government departments like water resources, forest and environment, as well as rural development. But the time that he was part of the OSDMA was also a key part of the recovery period post the 1999 cyclone, because he was there from 2001 to 2003. So getting insights from him for that specific period would be very, very important for us. Ms. Rita Missal is a recovery advisor and policy specialist with the UNDP's Crisis Bureau, where she has been involved in the design, assessment, and management of post-crisis recovery, disaster risk reduction, and climate change. She has experience in working with international affairs, policy analysis, coordinating intergovernmental and multilateral processes in post-disaster recovery, including several conflict contexts. She's currently joining us from New York, so thanks, Rita, for making the time to join us in the early hours of the day, especially. We have Miss Annie George. She's a rural development professional specialized in disaster management and DRR. She is the CEO and founder of Bedrock, which is, sorry, I correct myself. She's the director of Bedrock, which is building and enabling disaster resilience in coastal communities, a successor to the Nagapattinam NGO Coordination and Resource Center, NCRC, which was a multi-stakeholder coordination and program implementation platform set up after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. She was also a consortium manager with Christian Aid during the Rohingya crisis. So she's worn multiple hats, but she's also deeply connected with the area of Nagapattinam. So we'll hear from her on the issues arising from there. Mr. Jyotiraj Patra is part of the Oxfam water governance team and leads the Transboundary Rivers of South Asia project. He's trained by Partnership Brokers Association, which is PBA, and has previously worked in knowledge brokering and advisory roles with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, International Development Research Center, which is IDRC, and the United Nations. He was previously a response manager for Cyclone Filene with Christian Aid and senior program officer for DRR for the Aga Khan Development Network. So we have a whole variety of experiences in the panelists that we've got today with us. And apart from the panelists, we also have Rajsi Ray from Ladyfingers Go, who will be documenting the session graphically. So apart from that, the session is also being recorded and being live streamed. The relevant links will shortly be posted on the chat. And as the discussion progresses, I request the audiences to feel free to use the chat function to introduce themselves and share your thoughts as they come. But if you have specific questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the post so they don't get lost in the chat. That would be really helpful. So I welcome all the panelists as well as everyone in the audience. And thank you for taking the time today for this. So we start the discussion. The format for this first part of the discussion would be we take so I share a question and I would request all the panelists to take 5 minutes to sort of reflect on it. The question here would be that taking a view from your own institutional perspectives and geographical experiences, could you reflect on the current recovery policies and practices, highlighting the challenges and gaps in those for achieving equitable, inclusive, and sustainable long-term recovery outcomes? We'll start with Kamal, and then maybe afterwards we'll just go in a certain sequence. Kamal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So before I talk about the current state of practice, I just want to take a minute to say how far the practice of post-disaster recovery has come in our country since the days of the Odisha super cyclone, and I'm delighted that Mr. Behera is here. But even before that, I mean, I would go back far back to 1991, Uttarkashi earthquake. Since then, we have now a system by which, there is more equitable delivery of recovery assistance on gender lines. This is an innovation which was done in 1993, Maharashtra earthquake, in the Gujarat earthquake, and following that in Kosi floods in 2008, we played with the notion of owner-driven reconstruction. You talked about agency of people who are affected, and we really experimented with that and really came up with a method of doing owner-driven reconstruction, customizing it to different contexts. We took that same experience to post-earthquake recovery in Nepal, and the Indian government-assisted effort on recovery is really reflective of that. And more recently, the Finance Commission's recommendation, 15th Finance Commission recommendations, are really path-breaking. One of the biggest challenges we had before this 15th Finance Commission was that there wasn't really a predictable mechanism for supporting long-term recovery and reconstruction. And now we have a significant pot of money, 30% of the total outlays for disaster risk management by the Finance Commission are for recovery. So I think that's where we have come from, a disjointed recovery programs only after major disasters where international financial institutions got involved, to a situation where we have a predictable national mechanism for financing recovery. We have some specific practice guidance, owner-driven reconstruction, how to assist women-headed households, how do we make sure that men and women both have same kind of agency in driving the reconstruction and recovery program. I think there has been a process underway for some time to come up with a national methodology for post-disaster needs assessment. A lot of technical work has been done in that. Now, the next thing is to really operationalize it. I think we do a reasonably good job of planning overall recovery, and we'll talk about the specific challenges that remain in a minute. But how do we make sure that it's not just the large disasters that get focused attention on assisting people for recovery, but also small and medium scale disasters as well? Back to you, Garima.
Thanks, Kamal. Thanks a lot. No, that's absolutely true that we've come a long way since in the last sort of 20 years from sort of reshifting our focus from which was originally clearly response centric, but to actually look into DRR more comprehensively, and now more recently also thinking about long-term recovery issues. And it's a good thing to also hear from you that there are clear funding lines for investing into long-term recovery, which is more inclusive in many different ways. With that, I'll turn to Mr. Sekhar first, I think, to give his inputs on this question.
Thank you. Well, as you can see, the path has been laid quite over years of experience in this domain by different actors, be it government or at different points of time, different authorities at different levels, from national to district. In every level, it has been done. But what is very pressing as of now that we need to consider when we plan for recovery is the inclusion and the affirmation of the local self-governments and their involvement in recovery processes. This is a very clear part where Kerala could actually set itself apart when it came to conducting recovery processes in 2018 and then immediately in 2019. And this is primarily because that our local self-governments, as you know, are very profound, and their involvement in public development is also very unique. And associated to that, what we have to see is that while local self-governments do have a major role, many times, even in the Act, if you look at, there are only, the Disaster Management Act of India, we'll see only subtle mentions about the role of disaster or the role of local self-governments. So one of the challenges that therefore is faced when you have a very strong local self-government mechanism as contradicting to a departmental structure is that the priorities are different. And you can imagine local self-governments bring in a huge plethora of local expertise, and they are the best ones to understand the local needs. So yes, while that's a capacity of local self-governments, it is very much necessary that in the future recovery policies, or as we evolve the recovery processes, the presence of local self-governments are significantly highlighted therein. Yet another domain where Kerala had worked extensively for quite some time is the inclusion of persons with disabilities, and the way that it was facilitated in post 2018 floods. I mean, post 2018 floods. So we were working on disability inclusive DRR for quite some time, and we created our own guidelines for inclusion of persons with disabilities. We talk about 22 different types of disabilities. And when we looked for funding mechanisms, we must realize that there are no formal funding mechanisms available to support them. So we got the kind help of UNDP through the SURF funding mechanism, where UNDP came forward and provided us some assistance to create a separate assistance mechanisms for persons with disabilities or people who are in dire need, like persons who are bedridden or with terminal cancer conditions, who live in such households where the recovery needs are slightly higher than that of a normal house. And interestingly, the state government, Honorable Chief Minister from his Chief Minister's Distress Relief Fund, matched up the grant of UNDP, and we could extend it in a much better manner to a larger number of people. But then when you really start looking at formal funding mechanisms for inclusion of persons with disability in a recovery process with an additional assistance, then we find that there is a challenge and that we need to really bring in certain methods for doing that. Yet another domain, and which Kamal also mentioned, is women-driven households and how they are supported. I am sharing 2 links here in the chat box, which will help our audience to understand what our Kudumbasri, the Women's Self-Help Group of Kerala, has done post-disaster, post-2018, and of course, as it is being currently done through the Rebuild Kerala initiative, which was the spin-off of the post-disaster need assessment that the UN organizations came together and did for Kerala in collaboration with us. So yeah, women inclusion, when we talk of women inclusion, it is not often just about empowering them with certain funding mechanisms, but it is also empowering them through certain skilling process, which is exactly what we have tried to do. But that also needs to have a nationally formalized approach and a certain assistance mechanism, which will come as part of the new NDMRF, or disaster response and mitigation, NDRMF guideline. So that's something that the larger community has to ponder further. I believe I stop here and I leave the floor to the next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Sekhar. Thanks a lot for that. Absolutely, completely agree that the role of local self-governments is extremely important, because they're closely linked with that area. They know the ground realities, and one of the things that we've been discussing and we've been writing about in the project as well is that disasters are not necessarily an event, but actually a long-term process. They unfold over time, and local governments are probably closest to that, because they probably see the vulnerabilities in the processes that create those vulnerabilities, and many of them are sometimes just non-siloed processes, which may be because of health conditions or education and so on, which may not be something that we tend to see actively in the post-disaster kind of context. So yeah, definitely the role of local governments needs to be really, really highlighted. I move to now Mr. Behera for your inputs on this idea of challenges and the things that we've done so far on recovery. Mr. Behera, I think you're still on mute. I am. No, we can't. I think you're still on mute. I'm just trying to. Gargi, can you help unmute Mr. Behera? Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah, now I have unmuted.
Yes.
No, I can't hear anybody.
Oh yeah, so
Can
it's
you hear me? Can you hear
yes,
me?
yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. Can
Can
you
you
hear
hear
us?
me on the
Yeah,
Zoom?
yeah, we can.
No, I can't hear. Actually,
Garima, show a thumb.
Sekhar's presentation, I couldn't hear anything except the visuals which was shown by Rajashree.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's fix
Okay.
that.
Okay.
We'll
Okay.
come
Let
back
me speak.
to yeah, we'll come back. We'll try and fix that in the back end.
Okay.
Uh, and
I can hear again now.
okay,
I
you
can
can.
hear
Okay,
again.
great. Please go
Yeah.
ahead then.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, on recovery and policy priorities, I just heard Kamal Kishore's statement, and then Sekhar Kuriakose's. Although I couldn't hear him, but I saw the visual presentation of his of his uh, of his statement. He talked about inclusive of persons with disability, etc., etc. He said something on nationalized approach. Actually, I couldn't follow that. Anyway, so actually, what I would like to say is, there is a lot of gap between the policy statements, if at all there is any, and action on the ground. Despite our experience in disaster management over the last few decades, which is much more, which is much more uh, concerted, much more um, based and built on the learnings of the past. Despite all that, and also cross learnings from different areas of the country and abroad. What I see is there is considerable delay in recovery, both in respect of livelihood, infrastructure, both public and private. Uh, the role actually which is played by government departments, the local bodies uh, like the gram panchayats or the panchayat samitis in the rural areas, and urban local bodies in the urban areas, and the public sector undertakings, and if there are donor agencies who are working on the ground, there is still a lot of coordination which is required to be done, lot of follow up and monitoring which is required to be done. Kamal Kishore has mentioned about the owner-driven approach to reconstruction, especially of the housing stock. The owner-driven reconstruction especially applies to construction of houses damaged by disasters, flood, cyclone, earthquake, and so on. Uh, since these disasters are actually striking different areas at regular intervals. For example, Odisha has had uh, uh, cyclonic storms battering its coastal areas, at almost at regular intervals for last 3 years actually. This time in 2021, it really didn't cause that much damage, but the preparations were all there. But last year and year before last, Odisha was affected by cyclones. So it has become a regular phenomenon. So to separate the disasters, one disaster from others, and then monitor the recovery from each of the disasters, requires some kind of, yes, a, to put them in different uh, there should be separate monitoring for different disasters, because now I have a feeling they're getting mixed up. And at the state level, at the national level, I don't think there is whether that is being monitored. But at the state level, also the monitoring is becoming weak, as a result of which recovery, both livelihood recovery and infrastructure recovery, is taking much more time than one it should take. Then, actually, the recovery has to take into account the needs and aspirations of different target groups. Different target groups, for example, women, the persons with disability, children, aged, the elderly. So the recovery has to be all encompassing. No section of the society, especially the vulnerable sections, should not be left out. So my suggestion actually would be that the specialized institutions which exist to take care of the problems and needs of different target groups, they have to be also, very sensitive, and they have to be a little, proactive to monitor actually what happened to this particular target group in the affected areas, and how the recovery is going on. And periodic reports on the status of recovery has to be put in public domain. Actually, this regular and periodic updating of the recovery process, actually one doesn't come across in the it should be put in the public domain. And similarly, what tasks are, you know entrusted to government departments, the tasks entrusted to the public sector undertakings or local bodies, they have to be shown separately, and separate monitoring has to be done uh, for each one of the disaster that takes place, because the disasters are becoming more and more frequent. So that is something that I would suggest. There is a gap here, and regular updating, because uh, my understanding is that reconstruction and recovery are taking much longer time after the disasters than what they should, since there is now better funding options available, and the experience also, the now all the states, most of the states, are they have got much better experience in managing disasters in the last few years. Kerala, for example, it managed the successive disasters better because of the fine tuning of their preparedness. Odisha, of course, has been trying to minimize the casualties uh, by concentrating on moving the vulnerable population from the to be affected areas to safe places. That has been a major plank of Odisha's policy, but that much emphasis actually should also be seen on the recovery process, and both recovery of livelihood, public and private infrastructure. Another, for recovery, this psychosocial counseling, that actually is very important, as you have seen, especially for the children. And attempt has been made in Odisha after each of these recent cyclones, to do take up some kind of psychosocial counseling. But then I think that much more remains to be done. So there also, it's not only specialized institutions or specialized, the top class institutions like NIMHANS, which have a role, but the communities also will have a role. The community volunteers, will have to, we have not yet given that kind of role to community volunteers in the matter of psychosocial counseling in the disaster affected areas, especially for children. So that is an important policy gap which remains, and there is a need, and there is a capacity limitation, and that has to be also adequately prioritized. So that's all that I would like to say at this point of time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Behera. Those are really important points. And, you highlighted across all the points that you made, the role of multiple actors and also this idea of cross learning between them across geographies, which is really key and very important. You also spoke about, I think, another important aspect, which is about transparency in the monitoring systems, is so that there is clarity, there is also accountability involved, and so that there is a long-term view of things and how the recovery processes are really going forward. So I think with that, I'll turn to Rita for her inputs on this. Rita, over to you.
Thank you very much, Garima, for organizing this very important session. Particularly, the title is very striking when you say recovery with dignity. And I think I want to start that point and go back a little bit to the basics about what we mean by recovery with dignity. And already people have alluded, speakers, eminent speakers before me, Mr. Kamal, Kishore, Mr. Aurobindo, Behera, Sekhar, Kuriakose, and I'm sure the speakers following will also come to this. I want to go back to the definition of what we mean by recovery. And I'm often having to all the time fight when I try to explain to people that recovery and reconstruction is not synonymous. People think they use it in the same breath, recovery and reconstruction. No, when you do reconstruction, it doesn't mean recovery. So when we talk about socio-economic recovery, we have to distinguish between the roads and the bridges that are being built. That's quite different when you think about public infrastructure being built as from restoration of livelihoods of people and the psychosocial support that Mr. Behera was just talking about. So I think that's the first distinction I would like to make. Reconstruction is not recovery. Rehabilitation is not recovery. A full socio-economic recovery takes much longer. And you have already mentioned tangible and intangible effects of the disaster needs to be taken into consideration. And therefore, the intangible effects last much longer than once your house is also constructed. So yes, thank you very much for that introduction, Kamal, when you said that India has come a long way. And I'd also like to congratulate being a part of having learned my hard way, also starting from Orissa, about how far we should go into recovery. But I think the government of India's own support to UNDP in Nepal is a very good example. Owner-driven reconstruction just doesn't happen just because you're targeting a certain population whom you consider vulnerable. There has to be a lot of facilitation for that to take place, right? And so therefore, the whole aspect of socio-technical facilitation gains a lot of importance just because we understand that you're just by handing over some resources, financial resources to a widowed woman or a disabled person, the house does not automatically get reconstructed and they are not actually recovered. So that's first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is, yes, in India, there has been a change and I've seen the recent guidelines and I've participated in it. Globally, all disaster management acts have very few references to the recovery. And this is very sad. That's because we recognize that recovery transcends several planning cycles. It could go from 5 years to 7 years to 10 years in many cases. And so we put a timeline to a recovery. Even if you formally put a timeline to recovery in the assessments that we conduct, 5, 7, 8 years is what we speak about. And usually that timeline is set because we expect that the reconstruction will complete and not necessarily the recovery will be completed, right? So I think what is important here is that, to understand the disaster management acts have to be really reviewed very closely. If there is no recovery policy, there is no practice. You begin from there. In many countries where we go to now, let's say for Sudan, where we just recently responded to the floods, there is no recovery policy. The Disaster Management Act itself does not mention anything about recovery per se. So we start from viewing the point of, is there a recovery policy within the country? If there is no policy, how do you practice it, right? And all it takes, we began in, all it takes for recovery in many countries is just handing over some non-food item to the people who we think are the most, needing it. So we have this list in front of us saying disabled persons, women widowed, and children with disability should be given these packages first. Yeah, and then after some time, because of lack of financial resources, that is of course one big challenge. But I think the bigger challenge is the intent, and that intent does not exist within your guidelines and the rules and regulations. So that's number one challenge I feel. The second one, I think, I'm happy, very happy right now that the narrative in the recovery changes in the pandemic. There's no longer the reconstruction. So you don't have this whole push for let's first build roads and bridges, because in recovery there is always a competition between how much you can invest in people's lives and livelihoods vis-a-vis how much you invest in public infrastructure, right? Usually the budget for public infrastructure reconstruction is more than twice what it would be for restoring livelihoods of people for other needs. And you have to keep that in mind. So the often big ticket items are let's restore full power, let's restore all the roads and bridges. And it takes up all the resources and very little is left for actually livelihoods of people. And even for other softer issues, as Mr. Behera mentioned, the psychosocial counseling, the trauma, the networks in which people depend on, or even say the key issue of social protection, which has now gained so much currency and a much bigger space in pandemic recovery, where there's no reconstruction. And it's understood very clearly that resilience, building resilience of people is linked to their personal assets, yes, but also it's linked to some sort of systems and networks that will allow people to draw on when they face crisis, and that will support recovery. It's not about just giving them assets. So that's very critical. And I hope that some studies is looking at how we have seen this. I don't have to talk about studies. We've seen this where houses are constructed, people don't live in them. So there's a much more nuanced approach that one should take in even giving assets to people to ensure that they are living in the houses that is being provided to them. And I'm glad to say also that thankful to the government of India for providing those funds in Nepal, where for the first time you have very carefully constructed houses for tailored to needs of people with visually impaired disabilities, so that they can actually find their space, use local materials, training of people. So I think that's the two big challenges for me, is that recovery and reconstruction is considered synonymous. That's incorrect totally. If you want to talk about recovery, socio-economic recovery, it should be inclusive, of course, but that process takes a longer duration than we normally plan for. Number two is our disaster management acts don't mention recovery very well. So while there is, I think Mr. Behera very rightly pointed, there may be a policy, but there's gaps in practice as well. Or your understanding and my understanding of what inclusive recovery can be is quite different. So if one person says that if you give, some financial resources to a woman who's recently widowed, that's inclusive recovery. I would say we need to find out where that money is going. And I'm glad Mr. Aurobindo Behera found very clearly stated monitoring is the cornerstone of finding out what has happened to what resources has gone into it. The third point that I wanted to raise is, I think, recovery, the people fail to recognize that recovery gives an opportunity to actually strengthen and go back to the trajectory of development. This is the time when recovery, it allows you, if you take very carefully considered policy decisions, then I think it will allow you to actually move much faster into the trajectory of sustainable development, if at all you're planning for that, right? So the decisions that you would make in this space, given the resources and the political will that you have at that time, allows you to transform what was bad practice before into a much more sustainable, but also a much more, let's say, inclusive practice, but also considered planning that allows you to reduce risks. And this is the thing that we must highlight in our recovery policies as well. And this approach is not there. So we often, what we do is we can reconstruct where we have done before in the same site, sort of reconstruction in the same site and things like that. So this is about assets, but also in terms of giving assets to people as well. Then the final point I want to make is inclusive. When you think about recovery, look at the intangible effects much more carefully. So when we do studies, look at what it has caused in the long term: displacement of people, people moving away from the local, loss of livelihoods. As a result of loss of livelihoods, it can be child marriages, it can be teen pregnancies, it can be increase in gender-based violence, it can be abuse of the elderly. So there are all these issues that needs to be carefully considered when planning recovery. And how do we look at this from before? And so my last point in this in now would be, are we thinking about recovery as something that will start after disaster? I know, Garima, you spoke about being a continuum. So then if we are talking about preparedness, it's not necessarily preparedness for response. It could be the preparedness for recovery. Recovery, when we think about these things, because it's very difficult to set up immediately after the disaster to plan several of these aspects, particularly so things like in the pandemic, where we have a social protection system that barely reaches people, as inefficient from before itself. The amount of funds that is provided is very less. How can you expect to scale up, expand right after the disaster when it has not worked even before the disaster? So so in that case, I feel that we could invest a lot more in preparing for the recovery, just as we prepare for response by moving people out of harm's way. What are the provisions that people need to have? The last point is the point about the title of this, Recovering with Dignity. What is the space we have given for people to participate in recovery in any way, not as beneficiaries, but participate? I remember this in Orissa. I think Mr. Behera was also there. If you remember, we organized a consultation with non-state actors, NGO partners, and international agencies. And we invited someone from a person with disability. And the only point he wanted to make in that conversation was saying that, please give us a chair in your discussions, in the decision making, and not keep us in the background and expect us to receive all that you give to us. So I think this is an important point about engaging a lot more with people, to allow them the space to say what exactly and how exactly they want recovery to take place, rather than designing things completely so that people then don't know how to deal with it. It may not be culturally appropriate, it may not be something that they are used to. So I guess that's the last point that I wanted to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita, for that absolutely on the dot points that you just make. I think many of them we've also come across in our in our own research over these years, that especially the point that you made about the DM Act not having explicitly any conditions set out for recovery. I mean, the reason why even the legal recourse tends to not be very useful for people, because the act itself doesn't have the issues or a space created for them to even raise the voice through a legal recourse subsequently. So those are absolutely excellent points that you just made. I think I will also ask Annie to come in at this point, and then I will, Rita, I will continue some of these points that you just spoke about in the questions that I have for the group in the next section of this. So we'll continue on many of these discussions. Annie, over to you.
Thank you, Garima. I don't need to speak because I think whatever I needed to say, Mr. Behera and Rita have already spoken about it. So probably I'll just relate it to what has happened in our experiences either at Nagapattinam or in Kerala. One of the first things that I would like to say, what I'm reminded of is one swallow does not summer make. Just having a policy in place does not convert it into a practice. So what is it that's missing? Sometimes I feel that the policies have been brought out with very good intentions, but like we always talk about a last mile connectivity, there's a last mile gap that is lack of awareness, a last mile awareness that is missing over there. And for instance, if I can just relate it to some examples, like interest-free loans. Kerala very beautifully gave interest-free loans through Kudumbashree for the women to restart their MSMEs. Now, as a policy, that was fantastic. But then at the ground level, what were the operations set in motion in order to see that the women got the loans, there wasn't much of a discussion about it. And so the banks brought in their own stringent conditions, wherein they said these loans will not be given to women who've had outstanding loans against them. Now, there would be women who've already taken loans from the bank, but because of the flood could not pay it back. So the ones who really required the money, are being completely cut out of it because of these stringent operational systems in place. So while there is a policy that is protecting them, when it actually comes to operations, it does not reach them. So what good is a policy? For whom is it? And that kind of a question. So I often feel that the policies are brought in with good intentions, but it's more like a solution in search of a problem. So we don't really understand what are the problems at the field level, but we are under pressure to bring in a policy, and we bring in a policy, and that's it. And after that, another disaster comes in, and it's business as usual. It just goes on, and all old things are forgotten. Similarly, the other thing is housing. In Tamil Nadu, housing after the tsunami, they needed a long thing. So what happened? In Nagapattinam, there were about 8 rounds of discussions with the communities over there, albeit fishing community or Boombu Matikar, who are nomadic tribal communities. They still had very extensive rounds of engagement with the community to see, would this relocated site be good for you? But in that same state, in Chennai, this entire thing was just handed over to the housing board. So the slum clearance board. Now the slum clearance board has got a huge backlog of houses that they have to build for other people. So what it means is, when I did a study about 3 years back over there, the tsunami affected people still had not got their houses. They were still living in the temporary shelters or sheds that were created so many years ago. So while the policies are there and they're good policies, I think we also need time to look at how is it being operationalized, who are the departments who are looking at it, and most important, I would say that the community participation, I fully agree with Rita. How do we define community participation? We do tick the boxes, and don't get me wrong. We do have lots of discussions with the, but we don't truly engage with them. So, so if you look at Nagapattinam approach, where Dr. Radhakrishnan had so many different levels of conversation with them, you will find that there's more than a 98% occupancy of the houses that were built. But if you look at Chennai, you will find about hundreds of houses which are still unoccupied over there. If you look at even Puducherry, you will find that that entire, because it's 8 kilometers away from the fishing coast. And so people don't want to, the fishermen did not want to stay over there. So how best do we bring in participatory decision planning? How best do we bring in the people's voice into this? What is it that they need? What is their issue? And then you give your solution. Don't give a solution and just walk away. And I couldn't agree more with Behera sir when he speaks about have different monitoring for different projects, because I still know there are people who've lost their houses and you've given them owner-driven reconstruction. So the money, the first tranche has been made available. Now, these are poor people who then again depend on a contractor, and there are still unconstructed houses. So you've made them more vulnerable. They neither have their old house, nor do they have their new house. And they are always under the lens of the government system, where they come in, you haven't completed the house. Why haven't you completed the house? So have we really helped them at the end of the day? Is the policy in place? Of course it's in place. Is it participatory? Yes, of course. Is it owner-driven? Yes, of course. But to what end? So I stop over there, and maybe later we can talk about how was this solved. Thank you.
Absolutely. Those are absolutely a very, very relevant point that, that in practice, we are still quite far from so in aspiration, I think we are there. In aspiration, we do want to make it inclusive. We do want to make it participatory. We do want to make it equitable. But in practice, there are all these challenges that we, of course, are facing. And this big chasm between policy which is probably made again with a good intent at the back of it. Of course, I mean, going back to Rita's point that there is already a lack of policy for recovery. There is no comprehensive recovery policy as such, first of all. But whatever policies there are for, let's say, housing reconstruction or resettlement, the policies that are then used in lieu of a comprehensive recovery policy, then those actually do not, they are devoid of understanding recovery needs, understanding vulnerability, and understanding the other issues that are that arise because of the events or arise because of the ongoing long-term vulnerability. So yes, there is a whole lot to be spoken about and discussed on that front. I'll move. I know we're running a little late, but I think we'll cover up towards the end. Raj, I think over to you.
Thanks, Garima. Thanks for this opportunity. And before I start, I would just like to congratulate IIHS and the University of East Anglia for this research. Particularly, I would like to focus on two critical gaps. One is that of information, and the second one is with regard to innovation. Information-wise, in my opinion, one of the major gaps is with regard to generation and use of disaster risk information in recovery policies and practices, and also in the overall disaster risk management. Disaster risk among a given population or place, as we know, is dynamic and multi-layered, and it's linked to the larger socioeconomic, political, and environmental drivers, including climate change impacts at the local, national, and regional levels. If you look into some of the existing disaster risk assessment systems in our country, and the related information that they generate, and which is mostly used by policymakers at the national or at the subnational levels, most of them are primarily focused on what and who is at risk, but often miss the why and how are they at risk at a given point in time. And I think this missing link is very critical in terms of the policy practice gap that my previous speakers were alluding to. While immediate disaster loss and impacts such as loss of lives and livelihoods and infrastructure damage are very critical, for recovery plans and processes to be more inclusive and equitable, I think these plans also need to be informed by the dynamic disaster risk information, which captures the interactions among hazards, vulnerability, and exposure of a place or a population. The second aspect of this information gap is with regard to the data and information, which is mostly hazard-centric, such as we are very familiar with cyclone risk vulnerability assessment, flood risk assessment, and in post-disaster context, there are many hazard vulnerability risk assessment being done as part of the community-based disaster risk reduction initiatives. But what is one of the challenges is the lack of multi-hazard risk assessment, including climate change drivers. And I think this is very important in terms of the recovery, which one of the speakers was highlighting as to how recovery is a very long-term process. Recovery policies and plans, which are mostly use the post-disaster need assessments like PDNAs, they often miss these underlying drivers and the dynamic risk context. So I think the importance of having the disaster risk information system, which is more robust, but also takes into account the underlying socio-economic and political and environmental drivers of risk, are very critical when we talk about more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient recovery systems. The second one I would like to emphasize is with regard to innovation, as Mr. Kamal, Kishore, and others were highlighting how we have moved in terms of our disaster risk management and recovery policies and practices in the country. I think with increasing frequency and severity of these natural hazards, and particularly some of these specific geographies such as coasts and mountains, which experience frequent hazards, the need for innovation is very critical. And these innovations are needed not only in terms of technological innovations such as real-time and robust weather forecasting or hazard impact simulation model, but more so on the institutional innovation in terms of cross-sectoral collaboration, partnerships, and new ways of working to promote more inclusive and resilient recovery, including focus on recovery and restoration of vital ecosystems and ecosystem services, which not only provide livelihoods such as agriculture and fisheries, but also provide natural defense against hazards. And in Orissa case, we always come across this report of communities and villages who were sheltered with mangroves ecosystems were protected to a large extent during the Odisha super cyclone, and subsequent studies in many other disaster, particularly the Indian Ocean tsunami, which led to the establishment of the mangroves for the future, clearly highlight the need for more ecosystem-based recovery approaches in the longer term disaster recovery and reconstruction processes. The other important aspect related to this innovation, in my opinion, is working with the private sector. And I would like to emphasize a bit more on this because private sector plays a very critical role in recovery and also long-term reconstruction, primarily in the disaster recovery planning and implementation, mostly in infrastructure development and rebuilding of livelihoods. And I think their meaningful engagement and active contribution in inclusive and resilient recovery is not adequately mobilized in our current system of disaster recovery policies. For example, financial innovations such as disaster risk insurance and micro insurance, which offer the much needed financial support, not only to governments, but also to communities, are something that are not adequately mobilized at this point in time in our existing policies for disaster recovery. So in my opinion, the important aspects of disaster risk information being more inclusive, taking into account the underlying drivers and the disaster risk context, and most importantly, the innovation in terms of not only technology, but more intersectoral cooperation and collaboration, including new ways of working with the private sector, would be essential when we are talking about longer term and sustainable and inclusive recovery processes. Garima, I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Great, thanks, thanks Raj for that. I think with that, I'll also kind of move into the next part of this because we do have a little less time, but since I have the question for you, since we're starting with you in this one, I'll just continue with this point that you were making about information and the use of that information for humanitarian actors. And I think I'm reflecting back with the pitch that you've made that we've also pre-recorded earlier, and it's available on the website for the audiences, of course. But you talk about this importance of understanding drivers of vulnerabilities, which absolutely are very key in this. But going forward, when you say, when we think about humanitarian agencies, which tend to get activated post disasters, post this, the trigger itself, how or in what opinion do you think they can understand these drivers and respond to them better? What form can this information be made available at various scales and then be used? And how can participation be enabled for the humanitarian actors, especially considering the sense of urgency and the time constraints that are often, or resource constraints often that are quoted as some of the reasons? So any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, thanks, Garima. I think in terms of the addressing the gap in information and its use during the disaster recovery processes, one of the aspects which is very critical is this more interface across the science, policy, and practice. And I think this is very critical in the Indian context. And I'm just reminded of a paper, an academic paper in a peer-reviewed journal called Environmental Hazards. The title of the paper is Knowing Better and Losing Even More. So I think we often encounter and end up in these kind of situations. So the point I'm trying to make is, yes, we have, priorities, we have pressing humanitarian needs, but as part of the larger process of disaster management and recovery, I think we need stronger cooperation and collaboration between scientific institutions, which basically produce these disaster risk and climate information, policymaking institutions like NDMA, state disaster management authorities, humanitarian organizations, and civil society groups. And I think that would be an area where more such interface could be established on a regular basis. For example, this research and the workshops that you are hosting, these are apps, platforms which can facilitate such interaction. And the second aspect to that is I would just like to emphasize a bit more on the transboundary or the regional nature and the opportunities for such collaboration, because a lot of these humanitarian agencies, they operate across political boundaries and they have their global footprint as well. So ensuring that these lessons learned and the good practices are shared among actors, particularly looking at some of the disaster risk context, which is transboundary in nature. And I think there are existing platforms and opportunities like the Asian Ministerial Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction, BIMSTEC, SARC Disaster Management Center, which could offer such platforms which could ensure such interface between scientists, policymakers, practitioners, and humanitarian organizations. Thanks, Garima.
Great, thank you. Absolutely. I think this, and especially this issue is becoming much more real with COVID, this transboundary issues where, of course, this kind of collaboration needs to go across multiple areas now in this, in the context that we are in. I'll also shift to Annie to kind of, to also, in addition to what you were saying earlier about the issues in a place and how they tend to reappear or tend to appear over time in some ways. So there is a sense that that risks, since they're a continuum, and I think we've heard that now in this session a few times, that it's a continuum and the issues keep, they emerge over time. So looking back at your experience from Nagapattinam, what do you think are the opportunities of taking such a long-term area-based approach to address non-linear issues that realize themselves long after the so-called disaster events have receded? So any insights on that from you?
It is like this. When we go in after a crisis, we only tend to look at just that. We don't tend to look at the historical perspective. And is this giving rise? What are the other vulnerabilities that this is giving rise to? So that kind of thing. Now, we had good advice of people. So we went in knowing that the other hazards over there was flooding, and they did have 14 river systems. We did exactly what Jyotiraj Patra sir was talking about. We did a study on the different vulnerabilities over there. We looked at the coastal water bodies over there and found out how this is leading to annual flooding and why this was leading to annual flooding. So then we, with the help of other people, cleared about 4 river systems. But an NGO cannot do that. And this needs to be done on a regular iterative basis. So this is where I would say that what earlier we were speaking about decentralized approaches, empowering the Gram Panchayats and empowering the local communities to look at what are their issues over there, but at the same time building up platforms which will support interlinkages, because for things like river water management systems, etc., it is not decided by the boundary of a panchayat. You'll have inter-panchayat, inter-state issues as well. So how best do we look at that? That needs time. And we have that luxury of time. So unless we have a very realistic outlook on what are the core issues over here, how best can we handle it, who's going to handle it, and how long will it take, what is the budget for this? There comes a question of who will bell the cat, or who will take on the responsibility. So this is where probably we should go back to the Act, see how we can strengthen the Act, see how we can build in other operational platforms over there that can do all these things, knowing that these are the issues. And the second point that I would really love to make is give the people and the affected communities an opportunity for informed decision making. Currently, they do not have the kind of information they would require to make choices which are best for them in the long run. So even in the pandemic, how many states are coming forward with daily information to the community on what is happening? I think apart from Kerala, I don't think any other state is doing that. So unless there is that, so what happens if you look at the difference, you see people outside saying, okay, the number of cases as reported by the press, they're coming down drastically. So we've beaten the pandemic. So everybody goes out without masks. Despite the way it is. So how best do we engage with the people and ensure that you are getting their responses through giving them the right information at the right time and making them good partners, active partners in this way forward of recovery. So these are the two things I would like to say based on my experience. Thank you.
No, indeed, absolutely. This whole point about, them not even knowing, in fact, one of the things that we found is that media reports, while media comes and captures many of these, losses and their experiences right after the event, but then that's the end of that discussion. I mean, people don't even know what has been written about them. So, there is that, even that disconnect is quite big, because people have no sense of what is being written, and then how that then further influences decision makers, and then investments and the directions that recovery processes take. So even that little first level gap is a big one in terms of engaging them and making them aware of what is being said about them. Absolutely, I think, but I think if I were to take some points from this, is time is, as you said, is not in our on our side, but giving time is the only solution also. Places, because the sense of urgency is important, but then also making sure that some important aspects like participation, like inclusion, should not be given up because of lack of time. I think it's just something as simple as that. I'll move on to Rita on this, and I think it's kind of related to some of these discussions already. So I would say, Rita, reflecting on, let's say, this sorry, reflecting on the post-disaster needs assessments methodology that UNDP and you have been leading for a long time, and you've employed in dozens of countries, and now you're adopting that to assess COVID-19 related impacts and in many more. How do you incorporate assessing these intangible and unmeasurable losses and impacts to people and the environment
Garima,
particular?
we lost you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you?
now.
Oh, sorry.
Only a bit. Only a bit. I can get the
Okay.
gist of it.
Okay. Yeah. So just, reflecting on the experiences of doing that assessment of incorporating intangible and unmeasurable losses to people and the environment, what are those challenges, and what approaches do you think have helped overcome these challenges in some ways to make sure that even in those periods of urgencies when this assessment is done, how do you bring in that information and these aspects of impacts?
Thank you, Garima. Just before I touch on that issue, I think I'd just like to, thank everyone for bringing out this very important issue. I think once we have understood that a successful recovery is a well-planned effort, and this begins by preparing for it long before the disaster hits, just because it can go into two planning cycles of a government. We look at how we establish capacities prior disaster, where we have recovery policies, but also very clearly recognizing that recovery may be led by the government, but each agency has a role to play. So even if people who are sitting on this panel, let's say the Bedrock has a role to play as much as Oxfam has a role to play as much as UNDP and others. So I think that's very important. And the multiplicity of actors bring in different perspectives, and that I believe is the strength. The government can focus on reconstruction, which is important, However, equally important is the restoration of lives and livelihoods of people, the psychosocial support or their participation in the process. So perhaps this is not something that maybe the government may not be able to do it, or the panchayat level, the block level official may not be able to do it, but something that perhaps Bedrock can do, or something like Oxfam, Oxfam can do. And there are a host of other local agencies who sometimes get sidelined when something like this happen, even if they have been working in the same region, or let's say in the same villages for several years. So I think that we must recognize that recovery is a multi-actor effort, and not to be associated with one person. The second thing that I want to bring into this discussion is about having a rights-based approach to recovery. So it's not about having a policy where you think that person is a beneficiary, as much as you think it's the state's right to provide persons to live with dignity and freedom. Recovery should be looked at that in that space, the right to dignity and freedom within recovery, and the right to receive the support from the government in the aftermath of a big crisis, whether it's a pandemic or it's a disaster. It doesn't matter what crisis it is. This is very critical because, as Garima, you would knowing, when we are doing the pandemic assessment right now, in the COVID-19 delay in response measures to COVID-19 or recovery measures in COVID-19 has led to a lot of violence on the streets in Eswatini. In closing down, people had to flee. There were gun violence that has taken over in many parts, and for the last 1 week we have not been able to do anything, right? And so we need to anticipate the underlying drivers, as Jyotiraj mentioned. These are the underlying drivers. There was this simmering tensions already existing, and the pandemic delays in recovery of people in the pandemic becomes a flashpoint in which then people start to, break down and rebel against the government. And we do not want that situation to ever happen, and so that's very important. So think about a rights-based approach, and think about how you can address the underlying vulnerabilities, not necessarily disaster risks, but other risks as well. So coming to the assessment that you were talking about, Garima. So we call it the human impact of disasters, understanding the human impact of disasters. It has taken us a long time to advocate with the government to talk about human impact of disaster. They don't understand it very well. It was meant to be a complementary to the macroeconomic impact of disasters that the World Bank usually conducts, and that will show you, what is the impact on balance of payments, what is the impact on the GDP over time, and things like that, But when UNDP and UN agencies came together, for us it was important and very critical to understand that it's that we need to understand what happened to people, livelihoods, their food security, their living conditions. So that's how we began to define what we call the human impacts, by looking at 5 critical indicators, which includes the living conditions of people, issues of social inclusion, food security, and of course gender equality. At least these 5 indicators we started looking at very closely now, and over time we have been defining and refining the methodology in such a way that we expand also, and Garima, you've done this quite well, is to look at, if you look at these critical indicators, which are an adaptation of the multi-poverty index, we also try to trace what is the impact on the sustainable development goals, right? Now, while saying this, it sounds very nice. Conceptually, it's very nice. The first thing that we have, the challenge is to, allow the government for us to do such an assessment. They don't understand it. They usually understand. These assessments are often led by planning or ministries of disaster management or finance. And they immediately understand when you say you want to do an assessment of the transport sector, or you want to do a macroeconomic impact, or agriculture per se, but they don't want to look at the cumulative impact of all these sectors on lives and livelihoods of people. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is to find a home for within the government to be able to be an advocate and a champion for this thing, right? So while the subject matter doesn't sit very a very linear way, in a very nice way in a particular department or ministry, So the department, you may have to, like, we spend a lot of trying to find, should we talk to planning, should we talk to gender ministry, should we talk to maybe agriculture, because they also deal with food security. So the range of actors that deal with this issue of human impact is not one ministry, and therefore bringing together all to understand and do this research is quite challenging. The second one. The third, and the third that I think everybody is quite familiar with, it, disaggregated data. They do collect disaggregated. Don't get me wrong. I think we're pretty good at it. It's where you collect and how it is available to the people who are assessing the impacts of disaster. So I'm sure in a disaster, we have the age breakdown. We have the breakdown by gender, by sex. And still, after a disaster, you would never be able to get that right away from anyone. You have to really dig deep, ask questions, run from pillar to post to get that. So we need to have data platforms that are transparent, and data platforms that are available to general public on public domain for people to access the data. That's one of the things, whether it is gender disaggregated data, sex disaggregated data, or other data as well, disaggregated by age, looking at their generational or interrelational differences, Then the third challenge I find is that the issue of trying to understand the nuances, differences between, when we talk about women, it's not one category of women we are talking about. We're talking about women who may be widows. It's a different status altogether. We may be talking about teenage women, teenage girls who are just working and independent, but, we treat them as all in one bucket. Elderly women, they're quite different. Their status, the social standing of all of these categories, this nuanced approach is not well understood. And that, if you don't understand that, you don't plan your support to them very well, and so that nuanced approach is pretty critical. Number three, I find, is that the use of such kind of information after it. Let's say in Orissa, we did after Cyclone Fani, Navkrishna Chaudhary Institute of Development Studies made an excellent study, which kind of even used the 5 broad indicators. They kind of worked on it and developed their own index, index for, giving each district a ranking of where they are on the, what they call the HEALS index, because health, education, living standards index, right? But how was that information used later? Did it actually flow into planning social protection measures? Did it actually flow into planning, the psychosocial support? Did it actually flow into actually targeting livelihoods where it's required the most? Because this is what the human impact does. It will tell you by regions, by district, which are the pockets where most vulnerable people are, and what are the key issues, right? And so how do you look at those in a much more finer manner and hand that issue down to the right department or the person who is supposed to deal with it, and then take it forward from there to actual supporting to communities. So that's one. So there is no clear allocation of resources, and if there is no allocation of resources, nothing happens at the downward. So it's a lot of good rhetoric, and fine rhetoric, but no action following that fine rhetoric that we have done. So sometimes these assessments is a lot of effort, and I would like to actually, then Government of India has been very sensitive to this, and so far we've had to able to do this kind of assessments both in Kerala and in Orissa as well. I hope this becomes a standard in trying to understand the impact on the lives of people and not just on the infrastructure damage. So that's one of the things that I wanted to say. The second point that I wanted to make is that, I think when we are making measures or benchmarks for resilient recovery, that's the buzzword, or whether we want to build back smarter, forward, inclusively, stronger, whatever we want to use, the measurement or the benchmark that we use should also talk more about people, not about infrastructure reconstruction, So making sure that these benchmarks, if you have these benchmarks for measurement of progress, then you would be able to say, okay, we are going towards the road towards recovery, So it's not the hospital, and the pandemic proved that very well. So while, of course, we always rue the fact that barely 3%, 4% or 6% of the GDP goes into health and education, we know it's not the hospital building alone that makes the difference. It's about the capacities of doctors, nurses, all the health workers. And I'm glad India recognized ASHA worker as one of the frontline health workers. That was an excellent initiative by the government of India. But what have we invested in the ASHA worker at all? Nothing. We expect them to do everything. And the same for Kudumbashri, Mr. Kuriakose. We have relied on them to be the mechanism to deliver everything down the line to them, because that's there. And, and then we say we have done women empowerment. Well, I don't know if we have done empowerment or we are using those structures just because they are there, right? So an empowerment happens somewhere along the way, if at all, So I think that that thinking through these a little bit more. And I said also that I think government of India is at the front line a little bit more leading in comparison to several other countries. I also mentioned in the initial discussion about how government of India has supported UNDP only for social technical facilitation of housing reconstruction, which is a process they recognize that's not going to happen. And through this, it recognizes there is a process to reconstruction, even if it is uneven reconstruction. And through that process, there is a lot of rebuilding and restoration that happens. It's not about building, but it's about restoration. And this is what we consider that you're addressing when you do the human impacts of a disaster, about giving back people the dignity and not to be seen as beneficiaries alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita, for that really passionate input. Completely agree with all of those points, and this idea that, of course, aggregated impacts to people and to society in such times affect the trajectory of development overall, and which is why this the mention of the SDGs is also important in that context, where we see that if we don't take actions at the right time in a certain way, in a more comprehensive way, and in a way that's more inclusive, we will see the outcomes not just for those people in those areas, but overall for the state, for the country, and largely in a much bigger way. Thank you for all those lots of foods for thought. I'll shift to, we do have essentially 7 minutes left for the session, but I think just taking the moderator's position here, I'll continue with the questions that we've set for our speakers, and then I think within that, I think we are trying to build in questions also from the audiences. So one question I think to Mr. Behera would be also in this, drawing from the experiences of Mr. Behera, can you hear me first? I just want to make sure.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah. So the question for you would be that, drawing from the experiences of Odisha, where over the last 2 decades, as we've all known, that incredible advances have been made in early warning systems, in preparedness, in response to reduce life loss, etc., as well as more recently in recovery actions in the form of resettlement of those who have lost their homes, have been scaling up. But what would you recommend for an otherwise poor state like Orissa, but also there are other states like Behar and West Bengal, who are relatively poorer states, but to evolve, how can they evolve their long-term recovery approaches and measures? I mean, we've heard about finance being important. We've heard about capacity building being an important aspect. But what, in your opinion, would be the way poorer states can take a stronger approach?
I don't know whether I have a very well-tailored answer for this question, how the poorer states are going to cope with long-term recovery challenges. But one aspect that I would like to highlight here is that the policy consistency is becoming a problem. As I observe, from outside, often, the elected governments, in their anxiety to do something new, something better, or there is a knee-jerk kind of policy announcement in certain matters, which creates a problem with regard to long-term planning of recovery. One example I will give you, this pandemic. During the pandemic itself, an announcement was made that the orphans will be supported by the government, and the financial implications and so on. Some announcement was made. I don't know whether other states have done this, but in Odisha this was done. But while announcing this, it was forgotten that the orphans, they are not, they don't come into existence only in a pandemic, but there are orphans otherwise. There are because of loss of parents, because of accidents, big and small, because of various factors are responsible for uh, children losing their either one or both the parents. So, if a policy is announced, it has to take into account the similarly placed uh, uh, the target group, and it should not create inequities. It should not create differences in policy approaches towards rehabilitation uh, uh, of the affected children. So this is one example. One could give examples from other areas also. So policy inconsistency, because of the nature of our democratic governance, is creating a problem with regard to long-term sustainable um, uh, um, roadmap for recovery and restoration. Suppose after a particular disaster, a particular scale of assistance was announced. In the next disaster, another scale of assistance is announced. In quick succession, things change. The scale of finances also changes. So it must be causing a lot of difficulties for the people who are in charge of you know budgeting for the state and budgeting for disaster recovery also. So this is one aspect which we have to keep in mind. So how to overcome this problem? Institutional memory, loss of institutional memory, or lack of respect for institutional memory is one of the very perceptible phenomenon of recent times. Even the bureaucracy, the departments, uh, they, uh, they fail to point out the inconsistencies at the appropriate time, and the announcements take place at such rapid, in such rapid succession that it really becomes difficult to ensure that there is a modicum of consistency in policy announcements and the finances involved. So that would cause also a lot of strain on the state's finances of the particularly poor states. So that would be my response to the question that you raised. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. I think this idea, I mean, one of the questions in the audiences was also this thing about the distinctions between the approaches taken by the central government and the state governments and the local governments, and this, aligns with what you were talking about. There's this idea of policy inconsistency that exists, that needs to be addressed, and hopefully we do have some cohesive process and cohesive approach to dealing with these issues widely across the country. And yes, of course, this idea also of institutional memory is quite key, because as individuals move on, individual officers who've done things at a certain level, once they move on, it becomes a very difficult situation, because that with them the memory of the institution also tends to kind of go back to scratch. uh, so those are definitely very, very important points. I'll request our next speaker to also come in here, Mr. Sekhar, and I think I'll go back to the points that you made in your talk earlier, as well as I think in the pre-recorded video that you've shared with us. And you make an important point there about the role of land use planning and recovery. And today, just in this session, we've also heard this very important aspect about participation in that process. So bringing the two together, how in your opinion can communities and local governments be involved in the process of land use planning, uh, considering many of the underlying sort of causes of vulnerability generation are also because of the kind of land use planning that exists. So how, in your opinion, can this be addressed, can be acknowledged in the long term for sustainability?
Uh, Thank you, and I'll be very quick in this for want of time, as you have mentioned. Land use is primarily a sensitive issue when it comes to states like Kerala, where land availability, per capita land availability is very low, and where the land value is pretty high as compared to many other parts of this country. It is not just sensitive for that matter, but it is also emotionally sensitive for people. Yes, when we speak of participative approaches towards land use planning, it is feasible when there is luxury of land, but when there is no luxury of land, it becomes an administrative bottleneck by far. And then it comes to a stage where vulnerability linked relocation plans becomes stalled in the long run. So in Kerala, post 2018 floods, what we did was we created a vulnerability linked relocation plan where we didn't force it upon the people, and we didn't also ask them to relinquish their existing ownership of land. But what we suggested was that here we provide you 4 lakhs for building a new house and 6 lakhs for buying a minimum of 3 cents of land in a safer location. And you are permitted to keep your old land, but you could only use it for agriculture, but you can't use it for creating a dwelling space or a permanent infrastructure there. So this was taken well by a large number of people out of about 15,000 odd households that were enlisted by technical agencies and who came forward actually to move. About 3,200 people, means families, have taken this opportunity and moved in. And in many other cases, people have come back and told us that, well, the amount is not sufficient for them to relocate. So these are policy matters that will be resolved over time. But in general, the approach has been laid wherein you need to really not force it upon them, but rather offer it as a possibility that they could move on, whereby you will be able to overcome the emotional element of it. It is the stumble block. And when we speak of participation and participatory actions to move, once again, this emotional element comes in. And then comes the question of whether we want to force it upon them or not force it upon them. What is good in the long run? I think from the experience of Kerala, and that is exactly what we had suggested both post PADNA and also in the Rebuild Kerala initiative, Rebuild Kerala program, wherein we believe that the widespread living nature of the people of Kerala, the families of Kerala, needs to change. We have to bring them back. We have to move them together. We have to look at benefits of clustered living, and that is something that would probably eventually be more affordable to the state when it comes to protecting life and property of people in such places. So, but then what is the solution for this? The solution for all this is empowerment of local self-governments, empowerment of self-help groups. And therein Rita was mentioning about Kudumbashree, whether we conveniently used an existing system or we looked at whether this was the most optimal approach. Well, I think using existing capacities and building their capacities are more profound when it comes to long-term recovery practices than looking at developing newer systems and trying to empower them. Here in this, in the general administration, we generally see that people tend to create newer and newer and newer systems, but then forget that some of these old systems, if they're pumped in with the right kind of resources and capacities, might be helping you in the long run. And when you create newer systems, you add up newer burdens and probably more administrative bottlenecks. So yes, we conveniently use Kudumbashree, but that is because of the fact that we knew Kudumbashree will deliver, and Kudumbashree has over time delivered over and over in capacity building of women in the state. So yes, I think I stop here. Thank you. And there was a question actually to me in the chat box. So I told that I'll answer it online, but want of time, you can just refer it back to me. I'll reply it on the chat instead of replying it here because I think you have time constraints.
You can take a minute, Sekhar, to actually respond to it.
Yeah, the question was that, well, there was any, I mean, it was more pointed towards why or is there a dichotomy between what central government and state governments do? Well, this is many a times more political than practical. What I have noticed in 2018 and even before that during Cyclone Oki or drought, I'm doing this for the last 11 years sitting in the same seat, and I have always seen that if you know the right questions to ask, to seek support, you get the right kind of response. We requested NDMA for support for drafting the PDNA. We requested the NDMA support for the post-disaster need assessment. We did do it for the Dutch support to the state. Always and every time NDMA was forthcoming. We requested Ministry of Home Affairs for additional support from NDRF, and we got about 2,917 crores from the NDRF for supporting as per the norms of the State Disaster Response Fund. So you just need to know what you need to ask. You can't just say the government of India that please come here and run our show. No, it's whatever, wherever you feel weaknesses, you ask for support and it's forthcoming. So I don't really believe that government of India didn't do anything. Government of India did support, and the support had to be converged, which we did effectively. We did converge that support, and we had a large support from the well-meaning people of the world. We in a short period of time was able to mobilize more than 4,000 crores through contributions to the Chief Minister's Distress Relief Fund, which also was effectively converged and utilized for the post-disaster recovery, and it is still being used. So it's basically how you want support from Government of India and what you want as support from Government of India. And in that sense, I was never a party to what to this discussion of whether central government showed any lack of engagement. No, I don't believe that. Government of India did support. They did engage with the right kind of support that we asked for, and we are happy with that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sekhar, for that clarification to the audience member on that question. So now I think it's sort of like a conclusion, but I will put Kamal on a spot here. So So, we've heard today a lot of different aspects about what recovery means, what it doesn't mean. For instance, it's not reconstruction, and the fact that we don't actually have a recovery policy. We don't, at this point, there is only one disaster management. One disaster management act, and it doesn't have enough explicit conditions laid out or accountability laid out for different actors for a recovery. It's kind of left for in a more democratic kind of a manner. It's kind of left for all institutions to take care of recovery, and therefore it seems like it kind of falls between the cracks. So if you were to take up the idea of improving recovery policy in the country, what would be the key priorities that you would like to incorporate in that policy?
I can come to that question, but I have one or two points before that to preface my answer to that.
Sure.
The first thing I want to say is that, in this whole conversation, we have not really spoken about the role of the media. The government decisions after disasters to a large extent are driven by the public narrative, public mood. So, when somebody says that, a cyclone came and, people were efficiently evacuated, no lives were lost, that's a good narrative. But if someone says that the reconstruction was slow, but very thoughtful over a period of 10 years, now people of XYZ place are better off, it's a happier society than it was before. That kind of narrative hasn't happened. Till that happens, I think all of this is really a pipe dream. I think what I am hearing is basically there are two extremes. There is one extreme where, everything is about reconstruction. And the other is an inclusive approach, which basically improves the human condition after a disaster. And there is an all-round flourishing after the disaster. So everything adds up to actually improving the quality of life. Basically, reconstruction as an input to recovery. So, but in reality, what will happen is something in the middle. From a very practical standpoint, it is so difficult to do even preparedness for relief and response, what to talk about preparedness for recovery. So in that, basically, there are 2-3 things where I think we need to work together. One is that we need to have an easily understandable way of conveying what is it that we are talking about in terms of the real world outcomes. So can we begin to talk about saying that, before the disaster, there were X number of schools, but we are not interested in schools. We are interested in children going to school. But now the dropout rate has decreased. All the schools are functioning. So then it's not just about the building. So how do we go towards coming up with a narrative where everyone, governments, civil society organizations, and media, everyone begins to talk in terms of outcomes that actually determine, a better life or more flourishing life after a disaster. So that's one thing. The second thing, which policymakers often contend with, is the issue of what do you do when you see after a time the unintended consequences of revolutionary or well-intentioned policy decisions. So Rita was saying that recovery takes a couple of government's planning cycles, but there are very few longitudinal studies which will tell you about what, if in a particular reconstruction, and I'm deliberately using reconstruction, the decision was made to reconstruct in the same location versus moving people to another location. How did that change lives? And within that, there is the whole issue of, this is something that even civil society is found lacking on sometimes. We sort of promote some so-called good or best practices as a dogma. So is it really true that owner-driven reconstruction, and owner-driven reconstruction is just a label? I do realize that there is more to it. It's not just about reconstruction. It's about facilitating a process where people have an agency in determining what is the kind of built environment they want, which will facilitate a better quality of life. Is it really something which works everywhere, or there are certain conditions in which it works, in others it doesn't work? So I think that's one thing. And my final point before I address the question itself is that there is a lot of emphasis on post-disaster needs assessment, post-disaster damage assessment, but you do not take into account what is left. So recovery happens on what exists after a disaster. So I think you have to supplement what exists, whether it is in terms of capacities, resources, local initiatives, cultural resources, rather than supplant it with this thing in the name of build back better or build forward better. So I think greater recognition of what is there. And then there is a sort of ethical or philosophical conundrum, which is that do we use recovery as an opportunity to fix all the ills of a particular society? To what extent can it realistically be done? And within that, this thing, Rita made a statement in her second intervention that recovery is probably led by the government. No, recovery is led by the people. Government is responsible for supporting and accountable to people to support recovery through various means, and in reconstruction is one. So it must be led by people, not just in a rhetoric sense, but in a very practical sense. Now, coming back to your question on what, if there were to be a recovery policy, what are one or two key things that I would like to address? At a very practical level, one thing that I would really like to see is that there should be better convergence of whatever assistance is provided towards a particular outcome. So rather than different line departments delivering assistance at different times without exercising their imagination to see how it adds up to actually, bring about a change in the life of somebody who's recovering from a disaster. So you have, ex gratia assistance for people who have lost a loved one. You have insurance payout. You have something related to crop insurance. You have something for women. You have some livelihood support. And all of these are sort of disparate, and they come to the household at different times in different ways for following different kind of paperwork. I think all of that, if it converges and you give a respectable, consolidated support, then you leave it to the household to the extent possible to determine their destiny. I think if we did just that, there are many other things that can be said, but, at a practical level, if we did just that, I think that will be great. And I will come back to the sort of policy conundrum in the face of media pressure. I'll give you an example. Mr. Behera talked about the assistance to orphans in the context of COVID-19. And he highlighted one complication. What do you do about orphans who are not necessarily COVID-19 orphans? They're orphans before that. But within that, the announcement from the government, the announcement is really far-reaching. So it's really long-term in a sense. It says that, X amount of resources will be available to the kid when he is 18, he or she is 18. And, you draw the interest from it to sort of do higher education. And then you have a corpus then when the child is 23. Now, so this is really sort of, like backloading the assistance, right? And there was such a hue and cry about it that, what happens to the child here and now, about the host family, and all the education was covered by the scheme, and the food and nutrition. Although for all of those, different state governments have their sort of, the announcement that I talked about earlier came, taking into account all of that is there. So it is very difficult, so very, very, very few quarters are applauding that this is really far-reaching. This is really thinking long-term. There are no buyers for long-term. I'm not talking about the people themselves, in the public discourse. So how do we sort of engage with the media? How do we come up with an alternate public discourse to sort of have that kind of vision for recovery? Thank you.
Those are excellent suggestions, Kamal. Completely, I'm with you on that, on this idea of having a very outcomes-based kind of an approach to understanding what inputs are really going in. I think it goes back to Mr. Behera's point that he was making, that there needs to be a sort of long-term monitoring process that kind of connects recovery outcomes with actions, and then to determine how these different pieces of the jigsaw kind of feed into a long-term, a more cohesive result for the people and places. I think that's definitely, I think, a very, very, if there would be a recovery policy which has that embedded into it, I think that would be quite victorious in itself. But then again, I think this idea that you just ended with, that there are no buyers for long term. So if there are, if that's the thought we're going to leave with, then we do need to kind of keep addressing and keep coming back to it as to how we make long term, what are the tools, what are the imaginations, what are the current frameworks in place which can actually drive a political will towards a long term approach. And as you said, that's not just political will of the government, but also in terms of people. And I'm with you also on that even at the community level, sometimes the imagination for long term is sometimes limited. We have met communities who've come across and who know that the actions that they are taking at this point are possibly going to be going to have repercussions for their next generations in terms of environmental conditions, in terms of availability of resources, etc. But at this point, they don't have an option. So in what ways can we enable them to actually think of an alternative which can help them address the long-term issues? Because it's not that they are not aware of it, but they don't have the right resources, they don't have the tools and the capabilities at this point to actually address the long-term outcomes for themselves and the future generations in some ways. So yeah, I think that with that, I will not try and conclude this really very fascinating and complex discussion. There's no way I can do justice to it, but I will get each one of you to just take a look at the final sort of graphic that is there in front of us, and we'll share this, and then we'll probably add to this at some point, go deeper, and then try and address many of the questions that we've raised today over the course of the next 2 days as well, in different ways, and hopefully by the end of it we have some directions that we come to as to what recovery really means. That was an important question by one of our audience members, but there is no way I think we have an answer to it at this point. So thank you all. Thank you all so much on the panel and also in the audiences for taking the time today to not just stay for the session, but also longer than the session. So really thank you all for the patience and for engaging so passionately into this really important issue of long-term recovery. This session, as I said earlier, is being recorded and is going to be available on the IHS YouTube channel, as well as on the website, which is www.recoverywithdignity.ihs.co.in. So I urge you all to please go in, and there are also other resources, including a media review that we had undertaken as part of this process. So that also is there on the website in case anybody is interested, since Kamal mentioned that right towards the end of his statement. So thank you all. And look forward to having most of you also in the sessions tomorrow and day after, where we try and look into the issues.